Edmund Cavendish had a face that looked like it had been carved by someone who never learned to smile. Not cruel, not kind, just settled, the way stone settles after 100 years of rain. He stood at the top of the staircase of Dunmore Hall on the morning Miss Clara Ashworth arrived, and he watched her come through the door with her brown traveling bag, her good wool coat that had seen better winters, and the kind of back that told him she would not be easy to frighten. He had frightened the last 2 governesses inside a week. She did not look up at him. He walked back to his library. Outside, the Yorkshire moors were doing that thing they always did in November, which was to look like the beginning of a very long story, with no cheerful ending. The sky was the color of old pewter. The wind had teeth. Clara Ashworth stood in the entrance hall of Dunmore Hall and set her bag down and breathed in the smell of the place, which was wood smoke and old books and something underneath those things that she could not name, something that lived in houses where people had been very happy once and then stopped being happy, and had never quite figured out where the happiness had gone. She already felt at home. This was not a good sign for the Duke. The children came to find her before any member of staff thought to introduce them. They materialized at the end of the corridor the way children in big houses do, as though they have been hiding inside the walls watching through small holes, waiting. The eldest was a boy called George, 14, with his father's jaw and none of his father's closed-offness, not yet. The middle child was a girl called Frances, 11, already reading things she had likely been told were too old for her, and looking at Clara with the measuring eye of someone deciding whether to trust. The youngest was a boy called Henry, 7, who had a gap in his front teeth and immediately held Clara's hand without asking permission. She let him. They walked her through the hall as though they owned it, which in every way that mattered, they did. They showed her the room where the roof leaked, the fireplace in the east sitting room that drew so badly you were better off cold, the 3rd step on the back stairs that groaned like a living thing if you stepped on the left side. She was shown the Duke's library with the reverence one reserved for cathedrals or unexploded ordnance. "The door is always closed," Frances said. "You do not knock," George added. Henry said nothing, still holding her hand. At dinner that evening she ate with the children in the nursery. The Duke ate alone in the dining room, as he did every night. The housekeeper, a stout woman named Mrs. Payne who had clearly been at Dunmore Hall long enough to have opinions about everything, and the sense to mostly keep them to herself, told Clara this with a flat voice that delivered the fact and dared her to make something of it. Clara made nothing of it. She poured Henry's milk and cut his bread, and asked Frances what she was reading, and listened while George explained, in great unnecessary detail, why the previous governesses had left. The first had cried a great deal. The second had not cried at all but had left a very stiff letter for the Duke and departed before dawn. Clara listened to all of this without expression. "And you?" George said, with the directness that 14-year-olds believe is maturity. "How long do you think you will last?" Clara considered this. "I haven't decided to leave yet," she said. George looked at her the way Frances had looked at her. That measuring look, but with something added to it now. A beginning of something. She tucked Henry in that night and sat on the edge of his bed while he asked her a question that froze the air in the room so completely she had to look at the ceiling for a moment before she could answer it. "Is my mother in heaven?" he said. 7 years old. The gap in his teeth. His father's gray eyes. She looked back at him. "I think," she said carefully, "that wherever she is, she can hear you if you talk to her." Henry considered this with great seriousness. Then he turned over and went to sleep. Clara sat in the dark for a moment after, in the particular silence of a house where something irreplaceable has been lost, and then she got up and went to her own room and lay on top of her bed without taking her shoes off, and stared at the ceiling until she had sorted herself out. She was sorted by morning. The Duke appeared at the breakfast table once in that first week, just once. He sat at the head of the table and drank his coffee and read his paper, and the children sat in a row and were remarkably well behaved in a way that told Clara they were frightened, which told her more about the state of things at Dunmore Hall than anything Mrs. Payne had said. She sat at her own place and drank her tea and did not look at the Duke, and he did not look at her. He was gone before they finished eating. Frances said, quietly, that he used to eat with them every morning. Before. Clara heard the weight in that word and did not touch it. 2 weeks later she started teaching them in the morning room, which had the best light: French, mathematics, history, composition. She did not teach the way the previous governesses had taught, or the way the Duke had presumably expected her to teach, which was to stand at the front of the room with a textbook and a long face and expect things to be memorized. She sat among them. She argued with George about Napoleon until he was standing up and waving his hands. She let Frances correct her French pronunciation, which Frances did with enormous satisfaction. Henry, who was still too young for most of what she was teaching the others, sat beside her and drew horses in the margins of his papers, and she said nothing about it, because the horses were excellent, and because there were worse things a child could be doing. The Duke passed the morning room door twice that week. Both times the door was open. Both times, Clara saw the shadow stop for a moment in the doorway. Both times, it moved on. She taught Henry to count to 100 in French, sitting on the kitchen floor in the afternoon when Cook was not in. And they ate bread with butter, and Henry got it on his chin and counted all the way to 87 before losing interest in a spectacular and definitive way. She walked Frances through the moors on Thursday afternoon when the weather permitted, and they talked about books, which meant they talked about everything. She sat with George on Saturday evening in the library anteroom, the room beside the Duke's library, the one where books that didn't quite fit anywhere else were kept, and she helped him with Latin, which he was behind in and ashamed about being behind in, and she said nothing about the shame, only about the Latin. She did not see the Duke again for 9 days. When she did, it was not by arrangement. She had come down at 10:30 at night because Henry had a nightmare and needed water and had then needed her to stay for a while, and she had stayed until he was deep in sleep again, and on her way back along the upper corridor she passed a window, and through it she could see a light in the garden below. Someone was standing in the walled garden with a lantern, standing still, not walking, just standing in the dark with the light, looking at something that might have been the rose beds, which were bare and wintered over and not much to look at. She did not stop to watch. She went to bed. But she knew it was him. By the middle of December, something had changed in Dunmore Hall in the way that things change when you don't notice them changing, gradually and then completely, like the temperature in a room where someone has quietly lit a fire. The children were louder, not badly so, loud in the way of children who have been given permission to take up space. George quoted things at dinner. Frances had started a journal. Henry had learned all the words to a song Clara had taught him, a simple country song her own mother had sung, and he sang it in the mornings while he dressed, his thin voice carrying through the walls. Mrs. Payne told Clara one afternoon that she had not heard singing in the hall in 2 years. She said it in her flat voice, the one that delivered information without decoration. Clara said she was glad. The Duke's door was still closed. He still ate alone. He still appeared in the way a large cold weather system appears, briefly, before moving on. But Clara noticed, because she noticed things, that the books on the anteroom shelves were being rearranged, not dramatically, not with any announcement, just that on a Tuesday a volume of Tennyson that had been on the low shelf was now at eye height, and on a Friday a collection of essays that had been lying flat was now upright and open at a particular page. She did not mention this to anyone. But sometimes, reading to the children in the sitting room in the evenings, she raised her voice just slightly more than necessary. Just slightly. It was December the 18th when the Duke first appeared at a sitting room door during one of these evenings. Clara was reading aloud from a book of collected stories, something with wolves and winters in it, and Henry was in his usual position, which was pressed against her side with his thumb in proximity to his mouth, though not quite in it. He was too old for that, and he knew it. Frances was on the window seat, allegedly reading her own book and actually listening. George was on the floor pretending not to be there at all. She felt the Duke in the doorway before she saw him. The quality of the air in the room changed. The children felt it too. George sat up straighter. Frances turned a page she had not finished reading. Clara kept reading. She read 2 more paragraphs. The wolves were crossing a frozen river. She read slowly and clearly and did not look at the door. She heard, eventually, the soft sound of him walking away. She finished the chapter. Henry said, "Is he going to come in tomorrow night?" "I don't know," Clara said, "but we'll be here either way." That was the first time, alone in her room afterward, brushing her hair, that she understood something about herself and the situation she was in. Something she noted clearly, and then put in a drawer in the back of her mind and turned a key on. She was not a woman who made foolish decisions. She came from a sensible family. She had worked in houses before, none as grand as this but large enough. She understood what she was and what she was not, in the geography of a house like Dunmore Hall. She turned the key. She did not open that drawer again. Not for a long time. Christmas came. The hall was dressed for it, not lavishly but carefully, as though someone had decided that the outward forms of celebration should be maintained even if the feeling behind them had to be assembled like furniture from a box, piece by piece, in a cold room. Clara organized the decorating with the children, and they did it on a Sunday afternoon, the 3 of them on ladders and chairs and one another's shoulders, Henry handing up greenery and getting holly prickles in his fingers and minding enormously, and then forgetting he minded. The Duke was out. He came back at dusk and stood in the entrance hall and looked at what they had done. George was still on the upper landing. He watched his father, and Clara watched George watching his father, and the Duke stood very still for a moment, looking at the greened and candled hall, and then he looked up and saw his son on the landing above, and something crossed his face that was not quite a smile, and not quite pain but was somewhere between the two, the place where people live when they are trying to hold two impossible things at once. "Well done," he said, to the hall, to no one, to George. He went upstairs. George stood on the landing and looked at where his father had been. Clara went to the kitchen to help with the mince pies and said nothing, which was exactly the right thing to say. New Year came and went, and January settled over the moors with its usual indifference. The children resumed their lessons, the hall resumed its rhythms, and somewhere in the turn of that month, without either of them deciding it or acknowledging it or naming it in any way, Clara's evenings in the sitting room became a thing that the Duke was part of. Not by invitation, not by announcement. He was simply there, one evening, in the armchair in the corner, when she arrived with Henry already half asleep and Frances and her book and George and his stubborn pretense of indifference to stories. He was there with a glass of something in his hand and a book open in his lap, and he did not look up when they came in, and Clara settled the children as she always did and picked up where they had left off the previous night. No one mentioned it. He was there the next night, and the night after. Frances said to Clara one morning, in a low voice in the corridor, "He used to read to us, when Mother was alive." Clara nodded. She said nothing. Frances said, "I think he forgot how." Clara looked at this girl of 12 who saw things with a precision that should have taken another 20 years to develop, and said, "Sometimes people need someone to show them it is safe to remember." Frances looked at her for a moment, then she went back to her lesson. The Duke's name was Edmund. She knew this from documents, from Mrs. Payne's formal references, from the full title that preceded him in correspondence. She had never used it. She called him Your Grace in the rare moments when she spoke to him directly, and he called her Miss Ashworth, and this was correct and appropriate and exactly as it should be. And none of this stopped the fact, which she kept locked in that drawer, that by February she could tell the difference between his footsteps and anyone else's in the house simply by sound, that she had begun, without meaning to note when he entered a room and when he left it, that his absence from the sitting room on 2 evenings in late February, when he had business in York, had made the room feel smaller, in a way that irritated her considerably. She was a sensible woman. She turned the key. It was March before he spoke to her alone, properly, for the first time. Not about the children, not about the household. She had been in the anteroom, the one with the misfit books, returning a volume of essays she had borrowed, and she had paused because she was reading the page she was closing, and she had not heard him come in from the library until he was already there. "Lamb," he said. She looked up. He was looking at the book in her hands. "Charles Lamb," he said, "are his essays to your taste?" "Very much," she said. "He writes about ordinary things as though they are extraordinary." "They are extraordinary," the Duke said. "Most people don't notice." She looked at him. He looked at the bookshelf. Neither of them moved. "Good evening, Miss Ashworth," he said. "Good evening, Your Grace," she said. He went back into his library. She stood for a moment with the Lamb essays in her hand, in the quiet room with the misfit books, and then she put the volume back on the shelf and went upstairs. She did not think about him. She thought about him completely. Spring came and changed everything in the way spring changes everything in Yorkshire, which is less like a gentle arrival and more like something cracking open. The moors went from brown to a green so sudden and sharp it looked violent. The children went outside in every available hour. George took to running before breakfast in a way that was clearly about something other than exercise. Frances started drawing the landscape with a seriousness that suggested she was trying to own it. Henry found a nest with 4 eggs in the garden wall, and monitored it with a dedication that would have shamed a professional ornithologist. The evenings in the sitting room had become something different by now, not in form. The same chairs, the same reading, the same Henry pressing himself into Clara's side while she read, but in quality. The Duke asked questions now, about what she was reading, about the children's lessons, once, a single time, about her family, her father's work, whether she had siblings, in a tone so carefully casual it must have cost him a great deal to find. She answered simply. She did not ask the corresponding questions. She knew better. By the middle of May there was something in the hall that had not been there in 2 years, a thing Mrs. Payne named one morning without looking at Clara, while refilling the kitchen kettle. "Life," she said. Flat. Matter of fact. There was always life here, Clara said. Not the same kind, Mrs. Payne said. Clara poured her tea. It was the 16th of May when the neighbor's wife came to dinner. Her name was Lady Morland, and she was the kind of woman who had made a fine art of the remark that appears to compliment while doing something else entirely. She sat at the Duke's table and ate his food and looked at his children, and then, while the dessert was being cleared, she said in the warm carry of a parlor voice, clearly intended to reach the dining room next door where Clara was finishing Henry's supper, that it was remarkable how comfortable the governess had become at Dunmore Hall. Remarkable, she said. Clara heard it. She kept cutting Henry's bread. What she could not hear, and learned of only later, from the stiffness in George's jaw the following morning, was what the Duke had said in response. Not nothing, not a deflection. He had agreed with Lady Morland. He had said something that agreed with her, something that, in agreeing, had turned the remark from a neighbor's catty observation into something that had the Duke's name on it. George told her in a roundabout way, in the Latin room, the next afternoon. He told her without looking at her, turning the pages of his grammar, and what he told her was enough. She understood. She sat through the rest of Henry's story that evening. She tucked him in. She said goodnight to Francis. She nodded to George. She went to her room and sat on her bed and was very still for a while. The drawer was easy to close when the thing inside it had turned to something cold. She was summoned to the library the following morning. She had never been inside it. All of her knowledge of the room had been gathered by proximity, through the quality of light at its threshold, through what she had borrowed from the anteroom that bordered it. She stood in it now, in the morning light with dust moving in the air between the shelves, and the Duke stood at his desk and did not sit, and did not invite her to sit, which told her everything about what this conversation was before it began. He said she had misunderstood her position. He said familiarity was a governess's worst professional failing. He said it in front of Mrs. Payne and the footman who had been sent to fetch her and two of the house's junior maids who happened to be polishing the hallway outside, and who, Clara understood, would carry the substance of this conversation to every corner of the hall by nightfall. He said it with the face he had worn the morning she arrived, carved, settled, cold. She set down the book she had been carrying. She had been on her way to the morning room for the 9 o'clock lesson, and she had been carrying a history of the Napoleonic Wars that she and George had been working through together, and she set it on the nearest surface, a side table by the library door, with a care that was not calm, but was the mask of calm, and she said, "Of course, Your Grace," and left the room. She told Francis she was unwell and would not be teaching that morning. She went to her room. She did not cry. She sat at her writing desk and wrote the letter in 2 drafts, the first draft being the one she burned, and sent the second draft to Mrs. Payne before noon. The next morning she was gone. The house felt it the way a room feels the loss of its fire. Not collapsed, not ruined, still standing, still furnished, still structurally the same house in every observable way, just cold in a particular way that was new. Henry ate his breakfast without singing. Francis ate nothing at all and spent the morning in her room. George sat through the first hour of lessons with the new governess, a perfectly adequate woman from Bath, and then stood up in the middle of a French conjugation and said something under his breath that the perfectly adequate woman from Bath later reported to Mrs. Payne as being wholly unsuitable language for a young man of his station. Mrs. Payne reported this to the Duke. The Duke said nothing. He ate dinner alone, as he always did. He was in the anteroom that night, the one with the misfit books, and he stood for a long time looking at the shelves. He could not have said exactly what he was looking for. He was not looking for anything. He stood and looked at the books and the particular silence of a house where something irreplaceable had gone, and nobody had found where the happiness had gone. Again, and probably wouldn't, again. The Lamb essays were still on the shelf. He took the volume down. He stood with it in his hands for a moment. He put it back. He was in his library before the clock struck 10, and the door was closed, and it would be 7 years before he stood in a schoolroom in Edinburgh with a woman who was not looking at him either, the way she hadn't looked at him when she arrived, and understood with full clarity and no comfort whatsoever that he had done an irreversible thing in front of witnesses, and that the distance between here and any possible amends was longer than anything he had thought to measure. But that was later. That night he simply sat. The hall was quiet. The moors were dark. The youngest boy upstairs was not singing. By the time summer had settled into its full Yorkshire warmth, Dunmore Hall had achieved a state that the staff referred to amongst themselves, never to the Duke, as simply getting on with it. The children got on with it. The new governess, whose name was Miss Hartley and who taught with a quiet competence that George found maddeningly adequate, got on with it. Mrs. Payne got on with it with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had learned long ago that a house does not stop requiring meals and clean linen simply because its inhabitants were unhappy. The Duke got on with it in the way that large, cold things get on with things, which is to say he continued to be present in the physical sense without being present in any other. He attended the local sessions. He replied to his correspondence. He sat in his pew at church on Sundays, and the children sat beside him in a row and looked like the picture of a family if you did not look too carefully. Francis looked too carefully at everything. Henry had stopped asking about Miss Ashe by late July, not because he had forgotten, but because asking had produced no result, and he was a practical boy who understood already that some questions had no useful answer. George did not stop asking. He asked in his way, which was not to ask at all but to create silences of a very specific shape, the shape of a question that had been decided not to be spoken. He created these silences at the dinner table, in the Latin room. On the single occasion in September when the Duke came to watch him run in the early morning, which the Duke did once and then didn't do again, George created a silence of that particular shape, and the Duke stood in it and said nothing, and walked back to the house. The second governess lasted 11 months. The third lasted 4. The fourth arrived in the spring 2 years after Clara left, and was a brisk and organized woman named Miss Sutton, who made the children feel managed, and who managed them very well, and who the children were, to a one, relentlessly civil to, in a way that communicated their feelings about her perfectly. Miss Sutton stayed 2 years before she secured a better position in London and left with good references and, Clara would have been surprised to learn, a certain degree of relief. The Duke, by this point, had been to India. He had gone the previous autumn, for business that could have been conducted by letter, but which he had chosen to conduct in person, which meant he had chosen to be 8,000 miles from Yorkshire for 11 months. He wrote to the children every 2 weeks. The letters were correct and affectionate in a formal way. They described places and observations. They asked questions about lessons and reading, and one of them, addressed to Henry specifically, contained a small, careful pencil sketch of an elephant with enormous and slightly melancholy eyes. Henry pinned it above his bed. The Duke came back thinner and darker and with a collection of books that he distributed through the library as though placing pieces on a board, and he was, in the estimation of Mrs. Payne, who told no one and wouldn't have been believed anyway, slightly less cold than he had been when he left. Travel had not fixed him, but it had sanded certain edges. He sat in Parliament that winter and acquitted himself without distinction, which was better than he had expected of himself. He was invited to dine in the city with a woman named Lady Carey, twice widowed, elegant in the particular way of women who have survived difficult things and learned to wear the survival beautifully, and he dined and was perfectly agreeable, and on the third invitation made a polite excuse that was transparent enough that Lady Carey accepted it, with a grace that told him she had expected it. He was not ready. He was not sure ready was coming. He knew, in the way you know things you don't look at directly, what the obstacle was. He also knew that naming it would require doing something about it, and he was not ready for that either. He burned 2 more letters. A third one he got as far as sealing before he put it in the fireplace. Spring again. Third spring without Clara Ashworth in the hall. George was 17 and had opinions about everything, and the Duke was finding, to his complicated surprise, that he liked his eldest son enormously. They argued about things, the way the Duke had once argued about things with his own father, with the pleasure of 2 people who are not frightened of each other and have enough in common to disagree interestingly. They argued about Bismarck, about the railways, about whether Yorkshire was better in spring or in autumn, which was the kind of argument you have when you love a place and want to talk about it. George said, once, in the middle of an argument about something else entirely, Miss Ashworth would have had a view on this. The Duke said nothing. George was watching him. She always had a view on things, George said, not combative, not a question, just a fact placed on the table. She did, the Duke said. George looked at him for a long moment and then said something about Bismarck, and the argument went on. But the Duke thought about it afterward in the library, alone, the door closed, the way it always was. She always had a view on things. He had liked that. He had liked it from the first week, and had been afraid of how much he liked it, and had turned that fear into a posture of distance, and then, when distance had been challenged by a neighbor's pointed remark, and by his own confusion, he had turned it into something worse. He had said an unkind thing, in front of witnesses, to a woman who had given his house back its life. He knew this. He had known it since the morning after it happened. Knowing it, and doing something about it, were the same mountain seen from opposite sides. Francis was 13, then 14, then 15. She continued to draw the landscape with a seriousness that was becoming something real, a genuine talent sharpening itself against the stone and heather of the moors. And the Duke looked at her drawings and could see her mother, in the precision of observation and thought, not painfully but clearly, the way you learn eventually to think about people you loved and lost. Frances showed him her drawings on a Sunday afternoon in the spring she was 15, spreading them across the library table with a composure that masked a nervousness he could tell the difference between now. He looked at them carefully and said what he thought, which was that she had a real eye and should be taught properly. Frances said, without much expression, that the last person who had said anything like that to her had been Miss Ashworth. The Duke said, then Miss Ashworth was right. Frances gathered her drawings. She looked at him for a moment with that measuring look she had had since she was 11. She is still in Edinburgh, she said. George says so. She writes to him. I know, the Duke said. He had not known. He sat with this information, which was considerable, in the silence of the library after Frances had gone, and felt the full uncomfortable weight of having expected the world to stop in the absence of someone you drove away from it. She had not stopped. She had written to George, which meant she had not forgotten them, which meant she was better than he deserved, which he already knew. He wrote a letter that evening that was different from the others. Not an apology, not yet. He could not find the language for it that did not sound like an excuse wrapped in contrition, but something. An inquiry about the school in Edinburgh that a mutual acquaintance had mentioned, careful, formal, entirely inadequate. He did not burn this one. He held it for 6 days. He sent it. He heard nothing for 2 weeks. Then a reply arrived, brief, written in a hand he recognized from the neat notes she had left in the margins of the children's lesson books. Those corrections in small, clear letters that he had seen when he had opened George's Latin primer one evening 2 years after she left, and found her handwriting still in it, still bright on the page, as though she had just put down the pen. The reply said that the school was progressing well, that she had 12 pupils currently, and hoped to have more in the autumn, that she was grateful for his interest. She did not ask about the children. He wrote back. He told her that George was going to Cambridge in September, that Frances was drawing and should have proper instruction, that Henry had grown 3 inches in the past year and was becoming, against all probability, a person of great good humor. He said that the hall had been quiet. He did not say anything else. She wrote back. This time she asked about Henry. They wrote 6 times in total, over 3 months, each letter slightly less formal than the last, in ways so subtle he was not certain he was reading them correctly. And then the letters stopped. He did not know why. She did not explain. The last one he received was about the school, about a difficulty with a landlord that she resolved with a characteristic briskness he could hear even in the written sentence, and then there was nothing. He wrote once more and received no reply. He put his pen down. He sat in the library. He was very clear with himself, in the quiet, about what had happened. He had damaged something that should not have been damaged. He had not fixed it. The letters had been a beginning that did not become anything more because beginnings require a courage he had not quite managed to locate. He had burned more letters than he had sent. That, probably, was the problem. The autumn George left for Cambridge, Dunmore Hall was reduced to the Duke, Frances, Henry, Mrs. Payne, and a staff that had been together long enough to know all the particular silences the house produced, and what each of them meant. Henry started school locally that term, the same school Edmund himself had attended as a boy, and came home every afternoon full of opinions and energy and the names of new people. And the hall around 5 o'clock when Henry came back from school was briefly, reliably, loudly itself. Frances painted in the mornings and read in the afternoons and was teaching herself Italian from a book she had found in the misfit anteroom, and the Duke, passing the morning room one November day, heard her reading aloud in Italian to herself, carefully, the way she used to sit on the window seat and read in silence while Clara read aloud to Henry, listening without appearing to listen. He stood in the doorway, outside it, not in it. Old habit. He had become a man made of old habits, he understood. A man who stood outside the rooms where things were happening. A man who burned his letters. A man who said the cruel thing in front of the witnesses because the kind thing had been too frightening. Who mistook cruelty for control when control was the last thing he had had. He thought about all of this, standing outside the morning room, listening to his daughter read Italian to herself. Then he went to his library. A week later he received a letter from George. George was well. Cambridge was stimulating. He had joined a debating society and was apparently intolerable at dinner parties in the way that young men who have just discovered they are clever can be intolerable at dinner parties. And he was happy in a way that came off the page like heat. And at the end of the letter, after the news of rooms and friends and tutors and the river, George wrote, in the most natural parenthetical in the world, that he had encountered Miss Ashworth. She had opened a small school for girls in the new town. She was well. She was not married. She sent no particular message. But George had seen her, and she had been, he said, very like herself. The Duke folded the letter. He sat for a very long time. He was not a man who acted on impulse. He was a man who had so thoroughly managed his own impulses into inaction that he had become, over 7 years, a kind of monument to restraint. He sat in the library and looked at the bookshelves and thought, with a clarity that was almost physical, about what it meant to be very like yourself. He thought about a woman who had arrived at Dunmore Hall with a good wool coat and a back like a person who would not be easily frightened, and what he had done to her, and what the hall had been before he did it, and what it had been after. He thought about the Lamb essays in the anteroom. He thought about ordinary things, and how you could spend a great deal of your life not noticing them, and whether noticing them was still available to him, and what it would cost to find out. He wrote no letter. He went to Mrs. Payne. He told her he would be traveling to Edinburgh the following week. She looked at him with her flat, informative face and said, "Very good, Your Grace." She went back to her kettle. He went back to his library. He sat at his desk for the rest of that evening and was very quiet, which was ordinary. But there was something in the quality of the quiet that was different from the quiet that had been sitting in the library for 7 years. Something that was not quite like hope, but was adjacent to it. Something that lives just before the action, when you have decided. He had not burned this one. He had not written one. This time he was simply going. The morning Edmund Cavendish arrived in Edinburgh was clear and cold, the way Edinburgh mornings are in October, with a light that had opinions about everything it fell on, and a wind off the Firth that made no concessions to anyone. He had come from the station on foot, which surprised the doorman at his hotel but did not surprise anyone, who knew that the Duke of Dunmore walked when he needed to think, which was frequently. He had not told Clara he was coming. He had thought about this on the train. He had thought about it for most of 3 days. He had considered and discarded various reasons for arriving announced versus unannounced, and the conclusion he had reached was simply that a letter would have given her the opportunity to prepare herself in the way that she had prepared herself to say, "Of course, Your Grace," and leave the room, and that he needed to see her before she had a chance to prepare, because whatever he needed to say required her actual face, and not the face she put on when she was deciding not to be afraid. He found the school through George's letter, which had contained the street but not the number, so he walked the length of the street until he found a building with a small neat sign beside the door that said, "The Ashworth School for Girls, St. 1888. He stood on the pavement. A girl of perhaps 9 went past him into the door with a slate under her arm, glancing at him with the candid curiosity of someone who saw no reason not to stare. He waited until the girl was inside. Then he went up the steps. Before he reached the door, it opened. She was in the doorway. She had seen him through the window. He understood immediately. Through the window, the same way he had looked at her from doorways. And she had taken a moment, just a moment, before she came to the door, and the moment had not given her enough time to produce the polished surface, the courteous face. And so what he saw was her actual face, which he had not seen in 7 years and which was, without any alteration or diminishment, the same face it had always been. Clara looked at him. He stood on her front step with his coat and his carved face, and 7 years of something that was not quite guilt and not quite grief, but was considerably more than either of those things alone. She said, "Your Grace." He said, "Miss Ashworth." A beat of silence, the length of something enormous, passed between them. She opened the door fully and stepped back. "I was about to have tea," she said. He followed her inside. The school was small and warm and entirely itself, the smell of chalk and books and the particular industry of young minds being pushed in directions that were good for them. The girls, 4 of them, were visible through the window of the main room, bending over their work with a diligence that Clara had clearly earned rather than demanded. The room she took him to was off the main corridor, a small sitting room with 2 chairs and a desk covered in papers, and a window that looked out at a narrow Edinburgh street. She poured tea. She set his cup in front of him and sat in the other chair and did not say anything, which he recognized as the patience of someone who had decided that whatever was going to be said was going to be said on his initiative or not at all. He looked at his cup. He had rehearsed nothing on the train. He had decided specifically not to rehearse, because rehearsal would produce the managed thing, the controlled sentence, and the controlled sentence was what had brought him to this chair in this room in this city in the first place. He said, "I knew what I was doing when I said it." Clara was still. Not what it would cost, he said, but what I was doing. I knew. Outside, a carriage passed on the cobblestones. One of the girls in the other room said something and another girl laughed, a sound like a brief, bright door opening and closing. Clara picked up her teacup. He said, "You left your lamb essays." He had not meant to say this. It was not what he had planned to say, which was perhaps exactly why he said it, in the way that the real thing surfaces when the planned thing is abandoned. "I know," she said. "They were on the shelf in the anteroom for 7 years," he said. "I did not move them." She looked at him then, properly, with the full force of the measuring look that Francis had inherited, the look that sorted what was true from what was being offered in place of truth. He held it because it was the least he could do. "Why are you here?" she said. "Because George wrote to me," he said, and then, because that was inadequate, and she deserved adequate, and because I had stopped being able to not come. She set down her cup. She was not prepared for that, he could see. The not coming had apparently been something she had calculated into her understanding of how things stood, a fixed point she had built around. He watched her recalculate. "I have a school," she said. "I know. George told me. It's a good one, I can see that. I am not coming back to Dunmore Hall. I am not here to ask you to," he said, and he meant it, which surprised him as he said it. The clarity of the meaning. He was not here to ask her to come back. He was here because of the drawer in the back of his mind with the key turned, and because 7 years was long enough to know that locked drawers eventually rot their contents, and because the Lamb essays had sat on the shelf for 7 years and he had not moved them, and he needed her to know that, even if it meant nothing and resolved nothing and changed not a single thing. She looked at him. "Henry is well?" she said. "He is extraordinary," the Duke said. "You would find him considerably improved." Something crossed her face that was not quite a smile. "He could count to 87 in French when I left," she said. "I worried about 88. "He can manage it now," the Duke said. "He can also name 11 kinds of cloud and calculate the height of trees using shadows." She was quiet for a moment. "George writes to me," she said, "about Francis's drawings, about his debating society." "I know," he said. He had not known, and then he had known for 2 years, and both of those things were present in the 2 words. She heard both of them. She poured more tea, though neither cup was empty. He watched her hands, which were steady in the way of hands that have learned to stay steady, and he thought, not for the first time and not for the last, about what it meant to drive a steady person to the door of a house they had made warm, and what it said about you, and whether what it said about you was final or instructive, and whether there was a meaningful difference. She set the pot down. She said carefully, "What do you want, Your Grace?" He had been thinking about this on the train. Not the answer he would give, but the actual answer, the one underneath the answer. He had looked out the window at the countryside going past in the gray October light, and he had tried, with the honesty of a man who has spent 7 years being dishonest about a specific thing, to locate the real answer. "To know," he said, "that you are well, and to say, in front of no witnesses at all, what I should have said in front of witnesses then." She held very still. He said, "I was unkind, Miss Ashworth. I was unkind when you had been nothing but good, and I knew it while I was saying it, which is worse than not knowing, and I am sorry for it." The room was quiet. Through the wall, the girls were reciting something, a multiplication table, the rhythm of it going through the plaster like a pulse. Clara looked at him for a long moment. "I know," she said at last. "Not I forgive you. Not it was all right. I know," which was different from both of those things and more honest than either. He nodded. He drank his tea. They sat, for a while, in the quiet room, with the multiplication tables going through the wall and the Edinburgh street outside, and the 7 years sitting in the room with them. And Clara filled her cup again and asked him how long he was in Edinburgh. "A few days," he said. "George doesn't know you're here?" "No." She considered this. "He'll find out." "I know." The corner of her mouth moved in a way that was not quite a smile and not quite not a smile. "He's going to be absolutely insufferable about it," she said. The Duke thought about his eldest son, tall and opinionated and happy at his debating society, and felt something in the region of his chest that was not quite amusement, and not quite warmth, but was in the neighborhood of both. "He comes by it honestly," he said. She looked at him. "Yes," she said, "he does." There was nothing exchanged in that moment that could be named or measured, nothing that could be documented or reported or explained. Something simply shifted in the room, some weight redistributed, the way a room shifts when a window is opened and the air changes without the furniture moving. Clara set down her cup. She said she had a lesson in 20 minutes. He said he understood. He stood and put on his coat, and she walked him to the door, and they stood for a moment in the narrow corridor, with the smell of chalk and girls working, and the world outside the school going on in the way the world does. "Your Grace," she said. "Miss Ashworth," he said. He went out. She stood in the doorway for a moment, in the October light, the way she had stood in the doorway of Dunmore Hall when she arrived, with a back like a person who could not be easily frightened. Then she went back inside. He walked back through Edinburgh with his coat and his carved face, and the thing in the region of his chest that was still not quite anything he could name but was considerably more present than it had been when he arrived. He did not know what came next. He was not certain she did either. But something had been said that needed saying, and something had been heard that needed hearing, and the drawer in the back of his mind was still there, but the key had been taken out of it, and what was inside it was no longer cold. He had not burned this one. He had come. He walked until Edinburgh ran out, and there was the Firth, and he stood there for a moment in the wind with the cold water in front of him, and then he turned around and walked back. 3 months after the Duke left Edinburgh, a letter arrived at the Ashworth School for Girls that was addressed in a handwriting Clara recognized immediately, not because it had changed, but because it had not. The handwriting of a man who writes carefully and means what he puts on the page when he bothers to put anything there at all. The letter was not long. It said that the school endowment he had spoken with his solicitor about was settled and confirmed. It said that the deeds would be in her name alone. It said that if she found any aspect of the arrangement inconvenient, she was to contact him directly, and he would address it. It said nothing else. She read it twice. Then she folded it and put it in the drawer of her desk, the one where she kept things she was still deciding what to do with, and she went back to her lesson. She sat with what had been done for 2 weeks. In the ordinary way she sat with things. Not frantically and not by ignoring them, but in the practical Yorkshire manner of turning something over until you could see all of its sides. He had put her name on it, not his, not the hall, not a charitable trust named after his family or his title or his late wife. Her name, the Ashworth School, on the deed, in law, to be hers entirely. She thought about what it cost a man like Edmund Cavendish to do that, not financially. Financially it was nothing to him. What it cost in terms of the thing he had been protecting when he said what he said in his library, 7 years ago, in front of the witnesses. That thing, the pride and the position and the wall between what she was to him and what that could and could not be, he had put a hole in it deliberately, in writing, witnessed by a solicitor. She thought about that. She wrote to George. Not about his father. About Cambridge. About whether the weather had improved. About an essay George had sent her on political reform that she had thoughts about and was not afraid to share. George wrote back immediately, as he always did, at great length, with an undercurrent of energy that came off the page like something barely contained. Near the end of his letter, in a casual parenthetical that was not casual at all, he mentioned that his father had seemed different, recently, less like a closed room, was what he said. He said he couldn't explain it better than that. Less like a closed room. Clara read this and thought about the anteroom at Dunmore Hall, the one with the misfit books, and a man who stood in doorways watching without entering, and she thought about Charles Lamb writing about ordinary things as though they were extraordinary. They are extraordinary. Most people don't notice. She let a month go by. Then she wrote to the Duke, not to thank him for the deed. She had thanked him for the deed by a prompt and formal note the week it arrived. This was different. This was a letter. She wrote about Edinburgh and the school and a difficulty she had solved with the room layouts, and about a girl named Penny who was 10 years old and reading 3 years ahead of herself, and who reminded Clara, forcibly, of Frances at the same age. She wrote about the autumn light in Edinburgh, which was different from the autumn light in Yorkshire but not worse. Only different in the way that two places can be different, and both have things in them worth looking at. She did not say anything more than that. She sent it. He replied in 4 days. He told her about Henry, who had started corresponding himself, which Henry had apparently decided to do by writing his first letter to the horse he had most liked in the Hall stables, addressing it formally and with great seriousness. He told her that Frances was studying with a painter in York and showing a progress that the painter described as unusual. He mentioned that the anteroom had been reorganized. The Lamb essays, he wrote, are now on the top shelf, where they should have been returned originally. She read this sentence and sat with it. She understood that he was telling her something by means of something else. She had always been good at that kind of hearing. It was part of what had made her a good governess, and what made her a good teacher, and what had made her, ultimately, the person who could hear what a 7-year-old boy was really asking when he asked about his mother, and give the real answer. She wrote back. She said she was glad they had found their proper place. They wrote to each other twice a month through that winter, and then 3 times a month, and then, without either of them remarking on the change, every week. The letters did not say certain things. They talked around a large number of things the way people who are paying very careful attention to one another talk around the thing they are paying attention to. But the conversation, which was what it had become, was real, and it was honest, and it covered more real ground than either of them had covered with most people in years. In February, Henry wrote to her directly. This was, it emerged, his own idea. He had told his father he wanted to write to Miss Ashe, and his father had given him the address and said that was entirely up to him. Henry's letter was 2 pages and addressed her as Dear Miss Ashe, and told her in detail about the clouds and the trees, and a book about birds he had received at Christmas, and an argument he had had with George over Christmas about whether North Yorkshire or Cambridgeshire had better skies, and he reported the argument with tremendous journalistic accuracy, and with the clear expectation that she would adjudicate. She wrote him a long letter back. She ruled firmly in favor of North Yorkshire. Henry's response was 3 pages, and she could feel his satisfaction radiating off the paper. A month later, a letter arrived from George. Not his usual kind of letter, a different kind, shorter. He said that he was coming to Edinburgh at Easter to see a friend at the university, and that he would very much like to call on the school while he was there, if she would allow it. She wrote back and said she would be very glad to see him. He came on the Tuesday of Easter week, taller than she had imagined from the letters, with his father's jaw and the open-faced directness that his father had never quite managed to carry without the weight of the title and the grief getting in the way. He sat in the small sitting room off the corridor and ate the bread she put in front of him, and talked at considerable speed about Cambridge and his friends, and his debating society, and the political situation in Europe, and she listened and asked questions, and thought about how she had known him when he was 14, and how little and how much of that boy was still visible in this young man. He was 21. She was 34. Time, she thought, was a remarkable and occasionally unkind thing. At the end of the visit, when he was putting on his coat in the narrow corridor, George looked at her with a look she recognized, the direct look, and said, "He is better, you know, since the autumn." She said, "I know." George said, "He is not going to be easy to know. He never was. But he is better." She said, "George." He said, "I'm not saying anything." She said, "Good." He went, in the way that young men go, quickly and with a great deal of noise on the stairs. She closed the door and stood for a moment in the corridor. She was not going back to Dunmore Hall. She had said this to the Duke, in the Edinburgh sitting room, and she had meant it, and she still meant it. Not out of bitterness and not out of stubbornness, but because the school was hers and the girls in it needed her, and she had built something real and entirely her own, and she was not a woman who put down what she had built for any reason that was not worth building toward. But she was also 34, and she had turned a key on a drawer long enough ago that the key was worn smooth from being held, and she had started to think about what ordinary things looked like, really, when you paid attention to them, and whether the most extraordinary things might still be available to her if she was not too proud to notice them. Edmund came again in June. He came in June without an announcement, the same as before, and she saw him through the window, the same as before, and this time she had a moment longer before she went to the door, and she used the moment to breathe, which she did deliberately and with attention, and then she went to the door. He was standing on the step with the June light behind him, and his coat, and his carved face that had, she observed, been very slightly sanded by something, time or travel or the letters. She could not say which, but could feel the difference. She said, "You could have written." He said, "I could have." She opened the door. He came in. They had tea again, in the small sitting room, and this time the conversation was different, not in subject but in register, the way 2 pieces of music can play the same notes, and one of them is tentative, and one of them is not. She told him about Penny, the girl who read 3 years ahead of herself. He told her about Henry and the birds. She told him about the room layout problem she had solved. He told her about a change he was considering at the hall, a library expansion, books from the anteroom being properly housed. She said, the misfit books finding their proper place. He looked at her. "Eventually," he said. She met his eyes. The afternoon light was coming through the window at the angle that Edinburgh manages in June, which is long and golden and very sure of itself. She poured more tea. He stayed until 6 o'clock, which was later than the first visit, and when he stood to leave there was, in the narrow corridor, a moment of the particular kind that has no name, but that both parties feel. the moment where the distance between two people is smaller than the distance between who they have been and who they might be. He said, "I will write." She said, "I know." He said, "Miss Ashworth." She said, "Edmund." He was very still. She had not planned to say it. The name had simply come, the way the real thing comes when the planned thing is finally set down. He said, carefully, as though the word was something to be carried rather than spoken, "Clara." She held it. Then she opened the door for him and he went out and she closed it. And she stood in the corridor for a moment with her hand on the wood of the door and the June light at the window and the school around her, built and hers, the girls' voices coming from the rooms. And she thought about 2 chairs and 2 teacups and the Lamb essays on the top shelf, and extraordinary ordinary things and what it meant to stop turning a key on a drawer that should have been opened a long time ago. She was not going back to Dunmore Hall. She had said that. She had meant it. But there are things you say and things you mean and things that life, being the patient and inexhaustible thing that it is, arranges for you in its own time. Not out of cruelty and not out of kindness, but out of something much simpler than either of those, the same way Charles Lamb had known, and the Duke had known and said out loud in the anteroom in what felt like another life, the way that ordinary things, when you finally look at them directly, turn out to have been extraordinary all along. She went back to the sitting room. She picked up her cup. She drank her cold tea. She understood, smiling. Christmas that year, Henry received a letter from Edinburgh. He read it at the breakfast table with the focused attention of a boy who takes his correspondence seriously, and then he looked up and found his father watching him from the other end of the table. Henry said, "Miss Ash says she will visit in March." The Duke said, "I know. She wrote to me as well." Henry considered this. He was 13 now, with his father's gray eyes and the gap in his teeth mostly closed, still the most practical of the 3 children in the way that youngest children sometimes become practical, as though they understand early that someone needs to be. "Is she coming back?" Henry said. The Duke looked at his son. He said, "She is going to visit." Henry looked at him with the candid look of a boy who knows a thing is being carefully said. "Is she going to visit more than once?" he said. The Duke was quiet for a moment. He said, "I hope so." Henry absorbed this. He looked back at his letter. He looked back at his father. "Good," he said, with the decisive completeness of someone who has been waiting for good news for a sufficient amount of time, and knows how to receive it. He picked up his bread. He ate his breakfast. He was, from somewhere above the collar of his school jacket, quietly singing. The song was something very simple, an old country song, the kind of song that belongs to the warmth of small spaces, and the company of people who have made themselves necessary to one another, over the ordinary accumulation of days. Mrs. Payne, who was pouring coffee at the sideboard, did not look up, but she set the pot down a little more carefully than usual, as if she did not want to drown out the sound. The Duke sat at the head of his table, in the warm December morning of his hall, and listened to his youngest son sing, and understood, for the first time in a long time, what it felt like to not be the man standing outside the room where things were happening. He was inside it. He was, without ceremony or fanfare or a single word being exchanged that could be documented or explained, inside it. He picked up his coffee. Outside, Yorkshire was doing the thing it does in December, which is to be cold and bare and absolutely certain of itself, the kind of landscape that has no interest in being softened or prettied, the kind that makes you understand why the people who live in it learn, eventually, to love the things that stay. The fire was going. The hall was warm. The song went on.